So you know Russ. I know Russ. I talked to him for about 15 minutes, he and his wife at the Super Bowl. I talked to his agent, Mark Rogers, at the Super Bowl. They clearly were not happy in Seattle. You talked to Russ in the last 24 hours. He has a no-trade clause, Greg. Almost nobody in the National Football League does. There's 7 players. He's one of them. My guess is this is exactly where he wanted to go.
Yeah, this story doesn't come out unless Russ has waived that clause. This story doesn't come out. This trade isn't pursued without his blessing. And I think that's always been the arrangement that he had with the team. I think those stories of him going in with an ultimatum, like, I want to be traded, I don't necessarily think that was true, especially last year. I think there was always an understanding that the team, if the opportunities were ever presented and they were contacted by an organization or franchise that piqued their interest, it was out of the NFC, obviously not within the division. It was all those people saying, oh, San Francisco. No one's obviously trading anyone like his caliber within the division, let alone in the conference. But I think when an AFC team like Denver called, I think weeks ago, they go to his agent and they say, hey, would Russ entertain this? And I don't think they go through the exercise of what a trade would be like in this sense of, the back and forth and negotiation without his blessing and without him being a part of it. So I think weeks ago, they reached out to him and said, hey, we have this on the table. We're not saying we'll do it, but can we continue to go through the exercise of exploring it? I'm sure his team said yes. And when the two sides came to an agreement that both the teams wanted, they finally had to go to Russ and say, hey, we need your final blessing to announce this, to authorize it, put pen to paper. And I think Denver was always one of those teams that intrigued him, right? He wants to go somewhere with a good team, a good roster, good offensive weapons, good on defense, just hired an offensive head coach this last hiring cycle with Hackett. So I think it checked a lot of the boxes that he's looking for. He's not looking to go to a rebuild. He's not looking to go somewhere where he's got to start from scratch. And I think they check all those boxes.
Before Brady went to Tampa, we said really good defense, young in the secondary, excellent weapons, average O-line. The Denver Broncos, really good and young in the secondary, solid defense, great weapons, pretty okay on the offensive line. I really do believe this feels like Brady to Tampa. This team just needs a quarterback. I mean, you did the Cowboy-Bronco game. Denver beat them down physically for 3.5 hours. You've seen this team live. You've been in production meetings. I don't think I'm overstating it. I think Denver just needed a catalyst.
Yeah, I don't think you're wrong at all. I think there's a ton of similarities between that. I think the key difference maybe with this situation versus Brady's in Tampa is just that division's a lot stronger. I think the division Brady's competed in the last 2 years versus now what Russell's going to have to deal with out there in the AFC West with the Chargers. And I mean, that's a brutal division, top tier quarterbacks across the board. I think that might make it a little change. But as far as young and dynamic on offense, guys to throw the ball to, good on defense. Obviously, they lost Von Miller. They don't have a ton of pass rush. That was always kind of a little bit of a sticking point. Vic Fangio had that defense playing at an all-time level. That week we saw him play against Dallas. There's a lot of talk coming out of that game. Did that defense, and I know Fangio's not there anymore, but did that defense crack the code of Kellen Moore and that Cowboys offense? And people said, no, it was just one bad day. I mean, they blew the brakes off Dallas. In Dallas, as you said, we called that game. And we kind of saw teams steal a little bit of that design. Now, of course, it's a different staff, different coaches, but the same guys. That defense has young talent. They're very good on the back end, as you just stated. I think it's a very legitimate comparison you're making. My only caveat would be playing in that division, those 6 games a year. That's a tough sledding.
So I talked to 2 NFL general managers today. I said, I think Seattle, where they did a good job is not just to get picks, where they've often struggled drafting the last 6 or 7 years. They got some players. And people go, oh, Noah Fant. Both executives I talked to said, tough matchup, can drop a lot of footballs. Denver's got good pieces at tight end behind him. They're okay. Your thought as a former, you're going to get a lot of Hall of Fame votes at tight end. I like Fant. I don't think the offense is going to now, the backup kid they have from Missouri is like Fant, a very vertical, almost basketball-ish tight end. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I mean, when we called the game and we were going through the production meetings, we kept asking the staff, the offensive coach, we said, what about Noah Fant? Can we get him going? And they were complimentary, But there's a difference when a staff is like complimentary and kind of going, hey, he's a guy we like, versus saying he's a guy we're going to build around. This is a guy we need to feature. This is a guy. So you can kind of read through the tea leaves a little bit. You can get a good vibe. I think they like Noah Fant. I think if he was still on their team, they'd be happy. They'd find a way to use him. But when Seattle says, hey, and I don't know this was part, but you got to assume a part of the conversation was trying to get some pieces on offense. Tight end's been one. They're going to lose Everett to free agency. Maybe they felt like that was a piece that they could kind of leverage that negotiation. If they want to bring Gerald Everett back, who just signed a 1-year deal last year from the Rams, maybe that was part of the equation. If it keeps his price down and doesn't let him. So I think there's a lot behind it, but I don't think Denver for 1 minute said, oh, we can't get rid of Noah Fant to get Russell Wilson. I don't think that was even in the conversation. They got Drew Lock they got Lock out of there. Not even a hesitation. So as far as, right, to me, that pick is about the draft picks. I think the few players that they got in return didn't really move the needle very much, really, for either team.
That's what both GMs told me.
Yeah.
That the draft picks will be key. The timing's interesting because it's not a great quarterback draft. Seattle now has the 9 pick. They could go get Malik Willis or Kenny Pickett. Pickett's not, to me, a dynamic playmaker, nor does he have a dynamic arm. Willis is, I talked to another general manager today. They're like, listen, Willis is really strong with a power arm. He is not ready to play, but there's a lot there. Maybe Seattle, run. It's hard to go from Russell Wilson to Drew Lock. The drop-off is too substantial. The GM and the coach will get crushed. But I do want to address this. You were in that locker room. I'm from the Pacific Northwest. I've been highly critical of Seattle's schemes. I think it's antiquated. I think they run the ball too much with a bunch of B backs and an average offensive line. And I think it frustrated Russell Wilson to have to be the playmaker with a little bit of an antiquated offense. It always fell on his shoulders to make a play. And I look around this league and I look at Matt Stafford with the Rams, and he had better weapons. He had a better offensive line. A guy wants to be the man. He doesn't want to be the only man.
Yeah.
You were in that locker room. Is it fair to say Seattle offensively was a little behind the calendar, was a little behind the times?
Yeah, and I don't even, for my time there, I don't necessarily think it was a personnel issue at all. I think we had a lot of good players. Dwayne Brown was a good player. We brought in Brandon Shell, who was, I think, underrated as a right tackle. He came in the same kind of free agent class with me from the Jets. I thought he was a good, solid right tackle. They had some young guys inside. They drafted the young kid, played left guard a couple years ago, D-Lou. But weapons wise, Chris Carson's a stud. I know he dealt with some injuries this year, but that dude is as impressive a dude as I've ever played with. Obviously DK and Tyler Lockett, that's a real combo. I never thought they had a personnel issue. For my time there, I just felt like there was an ideological disconnect between what do our best players do, Russell, DK, Tyler, what are we built to do offensively, and what are we being allowed to do offensively? I mean, the conversations that I would have with the coaches as we talked about scheme and philosophy, and again, I was there a short time, and the amount of pushback and the amount of questions that I would get in return saying, we're not sure if we can do this. I'm not sure if we can protect this. And I'm sitting there saying, I've seen this happen for over a decade in Carolina. You guys have DK and you have Tyler and you have a franchise left tackle and you have Russell Wilson, who's at quarterback, both mentally and physically can handle anything. And I'd sit there scratching my head. It was like we were playing with a JV roster. It was like we were playing with a rookie undrafted quarterback. Like, it was very interesting to me. I just think the ideology there was always defense first, kicking game, punt the ball, field position, force turnovers, defensive led, and then they'd hand the ball to Russ at the end of the game and say, go be Magic. And I just always thought it was a very interesting disconnect that I never to this day have been able to wrap my head around. I just think it was part of Russell's frustration. I think it's why Russ said, I want to go somewhere where this is going to be an offensive, quarterback-driven team, not just in the media, not just as the face of the franchise, but every Sunday with the ball in my hand, like Aaron Rodgers, like the Stars, Brady. That team was going to go how they went. And I think Russell wants a taste of that. I'm assuming that's why Denver's going out and making this pick. They're going to hand the ball to him and say, hey, let's build this system around what you're comfortable with. Let's do what you're comfortable with. Lead us. Be that guy we feel like we've been missing ever since Peyton Manning retired. And I'll tell you what, they swung for the fences. I don't think it was a terrible trade. I don't think they gave up too much to get him. To get a guy like that, I don't think they leveraged the farm. And I don't think it could be a better match for both teams.
What was the secret sauce? How many practices, how many meetings with Russell, Greg, before you went, okay, this is a little different. This is a little more intense.
One, and I'll tell you, it's a funny story. So we were on like the brink of COVID. It was just starting to be a thing. It was March of 2020. I had just signed maybe a few weeks earlier, end of February, end of February, I signed with Seattle. COVID was like just starting on the radar. We had driven down to Florida for spring break. So this was like the second week of March. My kids were off of school and I'm down there. And he texts me. He's like, hey, well, let's connect sometime this week and start going over the playbook. They had sent me like an iPad with all the stuff. And I was like, great, let me know when. I just thought the two of us were going to jump on a call, talk about formations, talk about different routes, and just kind of as a get to know each other kind of conversation. Well, little did I know, I went up to my hotel room and he had his Zoom set up in his office with a whiteboard. He had half the screen with the playbook, like sharing his screen, half the board where he could write on it, talking through. Then he stepped back and he was taking me through 2-minute signals in his office like it was in the middle of the huddle. And I came down after, it was probably a good hour and a half, right? So my wife's at the pool with the kids at spring break and I come down, she's like, how was it? And I said, I've played with a lot of really good guys, a lot of really talented guys who did it right. I'm not sure if I've ever been around what I just experienced. Like it was a really, this is March, Colin. This is March. It wasn't even, we were a month away from OTAs, 2 months away from OTAs, let alone the season. It didn't matter if it was March on a Zoom call during spring break or the day before the Sunday game we played the Rams to end the season in the playoffs. Every single day, he was the exact same way. And I think that's the greatest compliment that I could pay him. The talent, the arm, the running, like that's easy. Everybody can just see that with their own eyes. The greatest compliment I can give him was it didn't matter the significance of that individual session. He never let it alter his approach. And I think that's like the best way I could sum him up.